Happy Taco Tuesday, everybody. Sam Shapiro back here with more of your Heat latest here on FanArc. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and, of course, drop a like on this video. We've got great daily content pertaining to Miami Heat and everything surrounding the team right here Monday through Friday. So don't forget to check out some of our other videos we posted over now roughly the last month and a half. And we're almost at 300 subs, so thanks so much for all the support. We've got a lot of interesting news to talk about today. Miami kind of looking back a little bit on their past, hopefully to maybe fix some of the struggles their front court has been seeing over the past, especially last season. Now looking at Precious Achiuwa and bringing him back on board as ongoing discussions to re-sign the former forward back to the 305 are now kind of actually taking shape and have been confirmed to kind of been going on. But it's interesting. This isn't really the first time I feel like Miami has kind of looked at their past to kind of, maybe bring in some assets that could potentially help the team going forward. I feel like this was kind of a rumored situation with Victor Oladipo. Not that the backcourt needed any help, but going back to potential old players, I feel like Miami tends to do that. It's not uncommon for Miami to maybe like reconsider a player that they had once kind of brought in before that had kind of been some part of the team. But Precious Achiuwa not really being a major difference maker. Former 20th overall pick in the 2020 NBA draft. He spent one season with Miami before being traded for Kyle Lowry the following summer. And last year with the Knicks, Achiuwa also really, quite honestly, I didn't really feel like he was making a whole lot of noise for the Knicks, averaging about 6 points per game and about 5.5 rebounds, shooting the ball pretty efficiently, which I think could be a decent asset to Miami's struggling front court right now. But in the grand scheme of things, I feel like working out guys like Kai Jones and then kind of some of the other guys we've talked about, especially over the last few months, that could maybe help fix some of the kinks in the armor in terms of Miami's front court would be, more solid assets than maybe looking back on a forward that, although kind of contributed into some extent for Miami's, depth in the grand scheme of things. He was really more back of the rotation type of guy, and I don't necessarily see him coming in and being a ultimate difference maker. I mean, you can't really say set in stone how it's going to go a second time around, but the Knicks obviously deciding to kind of take a different direction from him now kind of opens the opportunity and really opens the door for Miami to offer him a veteran minimum and really the last really full-term contract that they could kind of offer in terms of giving somebody a full-time roster spot at least this season. But I feel like the amount of trial and error they've kind of been looking at over the course of this past offseason, I feel like there are some solid options. I honestly, part of me would kind of rather have Russell Westbrook, although it's another guard. You at least kind of have a veteran player that can that can at least somewhat score in double figures or has shown efficiency in some terms of that regard. But in terms of what Miami needs, they don't really need another point guard, and that's kind of why I feel like the whole conversation of bringing in a guy like Russell Westbrook kind of has died down. And again, Miami does not need another addition to their backcourt right now. They're really kind of more searching for that kind of forward spot, which is also why I think it's interesting that Andrew Wiggins just in the conversation for so many mock trades for Miami right now. So drop in the comments if you think Miami kind of looking back on their past and potentially bringing in bringing back a guy like Achiuwa and having a reunion like that could potentially, benefit Miami in the grand scheme of things. I don't necessarily think he's kind of the best option. I kind of liked Kai Jones a little bit better as well, just because kind of showed some promise at least over the last couple of seasons as well, and I feel like would kind of be more of a presence and a bigger body in terms of what Miami really needs in terms of a forward in their front court, and could really, ultimately contribute to the size and physicality Miami is kind of, I guess, lacking in terms of player depth in that department. So again, drop in the comments what you think, if Precious Achiuwa might be a good player to maybe bring back into Miami's rotation. Personally, I don't think it's the best idea in the world, but I wouldn't be necessarily disappointed if he got the 1-year veteran minimum from Miami going into this season. And that kind of begs, another trade topic we could just been talking about that I kind of just mentioned earlier. Andrew Wiggins is now kind of on the subject of if Miami decides to go there, or if Andrew Wiggins decides to part ways with Miami when he becomes an unrestricted free agent, is he going to go to LA? Well, now the Lakers kind of emerging. This has been confirmed that the Lakers are kind of emerging as a team that really wants Wiggins, in some sort of exchange from Miami if he decides to part ways with him. The Lakers could pursue him if Miami obviously indicates that they're willing to part ways with the veteran forward. That's according to NBA insider Mark Stein. And quite honestly, I think that in the grand scheme of things, if Miami was ultimately going to part ways with Wiggins, I think a lot of it would kind of fringe on the idea of, depending on how some of these players like Palo Larson and Nikola Jovic kind of develop over the course of this season, because quite honestly, I think the ceiling is pretty high for Wiggins to be a 20, maybe 25 point per game scorer on Miami this season. I definitely think that possibility is there. And if that is the case, I don't really see Miami wanting to part ways with him, despite, having to necessarily pay him, I would say, at least $30 million. But in terms of, one year he would play. But I just think that the true value that Miami could really get out of him, especially if he hits that 20, 25 point per game threshold, is, I was talking about this in last episode, especially involving him in trade packages with Ja Morant. If Miami definitely wanted to load up on the star power, I definitely think, the ultimate worth of what Miami could really trade for in terms of Andrew Wiggins could definitely revolve around bringing extra star power like a player of Ja Morant's caliber to this team. And then when you're loading up with players like Tyler Herro and Bam Adebayo, and then you don't even have to add Kel'el Ware into the mix, who also has the ceiling to really become an all-star, then you've got an absolutely stacked lineup, or at least out of your starting four that you could potentially have in the mix, and then adding Norman Powell, who was arguably a fringe all-star type player on the Clippers last season. I mean, that team at least is unbelievably scary coming out of the gate. The only thing you have to kind of consider is if you're going to attach Wiggins, you would probably have to give up assets like Larson and Jovic, which are going to add a lot of roster depth, hopefully this upcoming season, assuming that Wiggins is kind of going to play at the similar ceiling he was over the course of last season, just being on that fringe of 15 to 20 points per game per night. So ultimately, I think Wiggins has a high enough ceiling, at least, or the veteran forward at least has a high enough ceiling in his bag right now that he could be involved in some sort of trade that would bring in an all-star caliber player like Ja Morant. But if you can't get an all-star player like that, I mean, especially if the Lakers are kind of looking at him, Rory Hachimura, Gabe Vincent, Dalton Connect, Austin Reeves, all could definitely be in some sort of package involving Wiggins and maybe some draft assets as well. Also kind of shopping Terry Rozier as well, which Miami has been in, at this point, desperate need to kind of get Rozier off their plate at this point. So I just think that ultimately the worth that Wiggins could kind of bring in is they could bring in, multiple guys that could, fill similar roles, but necessarily wouldn't be the void of covering that in terms of one player, which I think Wiggins definitely could. So I definitely think Miami needs to let the whole situation with him marinate and kind of see what he's really going to be in terms of what he's going to add in terms of value to Miami's roster. If he's going to be a starter caliber type player, or if he is not necessarily a good glass slipper, Cinderella glass slipper type fit, and would ultimately mesh better with Luka Doncic and LeBron in LA. But I definitely think in terms of where he could go, the value that Miami could get out of LA wouldn't necessarily be the best or most high worth value that they could get. I think they could really involve him in some sort of package involving to get a superstar player like Ja Morant, but I think they could also get multiple assets that would also add a lot of depth to Miami's roster. And assuming Kel'el Ware does become an all-star, you have Ware, Bam, and Herro, in a perfect world, 3 concrete all-stars, and then a really, really deep rotation with kind of assuming you're going to be able to keep Larson and Jovic in the mix as well, if you're really only giving up Andrew Wiggins and Terry Rozier for, players like Dalton Connect or maybe Austin Reeves in that regard. So drop in the comments what you think the worth Wiggins could bring in would ultimately be really worth it in the grand scheme of things, and what he could necessarily bring to the 305. Assuming he becomes an unrestricted free agent and Miami does decide to part ways with him, because now the Lakers making it very visible that if he does part ways, they definitely want to be one suitor to bring that veteran forward into their roster as well. And I think pairing him up with guys like Luka and LeBron, and then DeAndre Ayton, obviously, I think the athleticism there would complement the rest of that starting roster pretty well. But now moving over to another interesting thing that I kind of saw on Miami or Dwayne Wade's podcast. He was kind of coming at, well, not that the two have beef really, but I think it was very funny that Dwayne Wade was kind of getting ticked off surrounding Mark Cuban and what he kind of said. D Wade kind of mentioning on his podcast, he said that I heard Mark Cuban come out and recently say that the 2006 finals were rigged. And he kind of prefaced basically by saying he's had one conversation really with Mark Cuban. It was a cordial conversation, but he was kind of getting on the fact that I guess Mark Cuban was not really having that Dwayne Wade was getting a lot of foul calls in that series. And, Dwayne Wade kind of just outright pretty much said, but Mark, you got to stop saying that. We beat you. Did we get some foul calls? I mean, everybody gets some foul calls, especially in today's NBA. You see some of the best players in the league, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, being called a free throw merchant because he's getting, sent to the line 8, 9, 10 times a game. And then, well, he's, making 8 or 9 free throws rather. But I'm just saying, like, even players like James Harden, when he was at the prime of his career on the Rockets, I mean, there were some games he scored nearly a third of his points where he'd have 30, 40 points a night. He's getting at least 10 or 11 from the free throw line. And I mean, I'm not saying that was necessarily the case with Dwayne Wade, but 2006 Dwayne Wade was a textbook, one of a kind slashing guard that was attacking the basket at least 12, 13 times a night minimum. And, you kind of can't really get mad about that. And then, Dwayne Wade also kind of alluded to one of the games in the 2011 finals where Dirk Nowitzki had 48 points. He had 24 free throws in one of those games, eventually at some point when Dirk was kind of playing with them. And, that was obviously in 2011, but I just think that, getting upset, basically saying that the whole series was rigged over foul calls, especially when you have a physical player like Dwayne Wade who, just that was a lot of the nature of his game really was attacking the basket and being a physical player. And I mean, this was also when the NBA was different, when you didn't have hyper, outside scoring offenses and, primarily 3-point shooting, and not even a lot of centers were, I feel like, consistent 3-point shooters night in and night out. So you had a lot of guys that were more attacking the basket, shooting closer. I feel like the mid-range game was kind of more of a focal point in teams' offenses. So kind of saying that it was rigged over, excessive foul calls and all that, I just think is a little bit ridiculous. But I also think Mark Cuban was kind of upset to see his team lose, and Dwayne Wade was like, all right, stop it. It's been nearly almost 20 years at this point that series kind of took place. So I think you need to get over it and move on, especially because Dallas ultimately getting their revenge, just a few years later. You kind of can't really be upset in the grand scheme of things. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Your Heat Latest here on FanArc. Don't forget to drop a like on this video. And of course, subscribe to our channel for great daily content, all pertaining to your Miami Heat right here. Once again, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Sam Shapiro. Have a great Tuesday.